everyone. Welcome to the fourth in this series of CriSHET's and Anti-Racism Lab's workshop series on decolonization in context. I'm Shirley Ann Tate. I'm a professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Alberta and also a Canada Research Chair in Feminism and Intersectionality. The University of Alberta respectfully acknowledges that we are located in Treaty 6 territory, traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people whose presence, histories, languages, and cultures continue to enrich our vibrant communities. Our presiding elder, Elder Hilia, is sick today, so she can't be here. So she sends her regrets and hopes that we have a good workshop. I would like to thank our colleagues from South Africa, especially Jenny, for organizing this workshop and all of the colleagues who've come to share their knowledge and wisdom with us. I want to thank Manza for her organizational skill as usual. I couldn't do anything without her. She's become quite, a massive part of my life in a way. I also want to thank Jovi for their translation from English to Brazilian Portuguese. And I just want to let you know that your questions can be put in the chat, which Nomalanga and perhaps also Manza and I will be able to see. And we will certainly be monitoring them anyway. For the interpretation part, for Jovi's translation, please look at the bottom of your screen. You'll see kind of like a globe. It should be there. And that's where you can get the translation channel. I hope that makes sense to everyone. So I would like to get us started by introducing you all to my wonderful friend and colleague, Professor Andre Kiet. Andre holds the Research Chair for Critical Studies in Higher Education Transformation, CriSHET. He is the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Engagement and Transformation at Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. He was a visiting professor at the Centre for Race, Education and Decoloniality at Leeds Beckett University in the UK. He was also the 2018 Marshall Lillian Gladstein Visiting Professor of Human Rights at the University of Connecticut. He served as Director and Deputy CEO of the South African Human Rights Commission and on the Commission for Gender Equality before entering academia. He served as a transformation advisor and practitioner in various capacities in the sector. His research and postgraduate supervision focuses on critical approaches to the study of higher education, or as we would say in Canada, post-secondary education. I'll hand you over to Andre. Andre, please.
Thanks so much, Shirley, for that warm welcome. And it has been great to follow this particular series, great and productive discussions. And also, I think, highly appropriate for this particular global moment, which we are experiencing on so many fronts in our localized, context. So my appreciation to both you and Manza, of course, for holding the different sets of conversations together, and allowing us to approach it from so many different angles as well, with regard to our own experiences. So I also want to express my deep gratitude for the co-travelers in this work that we do, including the South African panelists and everyone joining the discussion in this online space today. My task is broadly just to frame the conversation about decolonization in South Africa for those who are here today and for those from other contexts as well. Now, the South African Must Fall movement, which reverberated across the globe on many fronts, especially in Europe, and then of course the UK in particular, has reintroduced with a particular sense of energy and vigor the language of decolonization into the university space, but also even beyond the university. And those have been to reinvest the idea of the transformation project of South Africa with a new energy and perhaps a more and better language that is attached to the broader project of decolonization. Our narrative has at that time been dominated by the question of the rainbow nation, rainbowism, and of course non-racialism. And the young people, not only the disillusionment with democratic institutions in general, but also the disillusionment with higher education and the lack or at least the weaknesses of higher education in addressing substantive material and epistemic injustices. So that particular call has more or less what one can say re-energized our discussion around decolonization in the 2015-2016 space. Of course, there was work before that as well. Now, academics, responded with a flurry of publication. I think that globally and in South Africa, this is probably the fastest growing area of scholarship on the university that deals with the question of epistemic violence and Eurocentrism, and the question of the dominance of the North in the way in which our epistemic consciousness, plays itself out within universities. And so there, we saw a shift, towards and in support of the discourse of decolonization post 2015-16. But, later on, the momentum, and especially the question of student politics and protest, has lost, some of its intellectual vigor and its radical orientation. So similarly, while remaining contentious, the language of decolonization also became assimilated into the scholarly landscape of higher education. And as this particular, shift towards the scholarship has happened, critiques also began to emerge. And you will also hear from the different panelists, how the kind of thoughtful critique of decolonization has become, one of the areas of enrichment and enlargement within our space here. The argument was that the discourse of decolonization has been hollowed out, it has been domesticated, its radical potential has been, disciplined within the different university spaces, and there's a number of research studies that shows how this particular notion has traveled within the university space, what it has achieved, and of course, the different sets of challenges it has faced. Some have noticed, some cul-de-sacs, and circular argumentation within the decolonization discourse, and of course also an over-romanticization that comes with a form of looking at the past as well. All these critiques, of course, is not, at least in our scholarship, is framed within the context of enlarging, enriching, and reinvigorating the discourse of decolonization, because we think that it is one of the most productive, interpretive schemes for making sense of where the university should go, given its own colonial history, and of course, what role the university should play with regard to First Nations people, the colonial project in its broader sense around land, the colonial project, in its broader sense around reparations and all the different areas of thematics, that normally comes into these discussions as well. I don't think that the university sector in general has lived up to those kinds of ambitions that the fallist had in the 2015-2016, must fall movement space. And so at the time when we thought, that we want to give different types of angles to rethink, how decolonization can programmatically play itself out in the university, we started off with a seminar series around beyond decolonization as a question mark. It's like more or less to where do we go to from here? That was more or less the way in which we framed it, but also looking for other kinds of languages that can co-travel, around the question of progressive change within the university sector. Now, this particular workshop series, the Decolonization in Context series, we read as part of this, project of reinvigorating, re-energizing the decolonization discussion through, of course, ways in which we can localize and contextualize the various ways in which we make sense of it and the kind of practices that we are putting forward as well. So this call is to grapple with the unique challenges of specific colonial histories, and as some of our colleagues would argue, we do have a particular and peculiar colonial history in in South Africa, being the double edge, or what, one can say, two sides of the same coin of apartheid and colonialism, and then how to address these imperatives in meaningful ways. So once again, Shirley, to you and your team, thank you for that. So I'm looking forward to the discussions today. And many thanks to all of you who have joined us across the different national contexts. And I will now be handing over to Nomalanga to introduce the speakers and also to steer our conversations. Nomalanga is our director for the School of Governmental and Social Sciences at the Nelson Mandela University. She's a historian by training, and her research interests are in African language and historical literatures, vernacular historiography, and the 19th century history of the Eastern Cape. Nomalanga, it's over to you, okay? Thank you so much, Shirley and colleagues, and thanks to everybody for joining us.
Thanks, Andre. Thanks, colleagues. And many thanks to Jenny and everybody for organizing us again today. Prof. Tate and everybody, thank you. We have 3 contributors today, and the way that we've been sort of asked to have this is sort of as a conversation. Let me just introduce my 3 colleagues. First is Farouk Abrahams. Farouk is a local small business owner and resident of Shorterville here in Gqeberha. He has been in local arts and education activism since 1999. He founded Save Our Schools and Community and is a member of the Aboriginal Business Council. I don't know if Farouk can show his video, but I'll introduce him just now for the questions. And then we have Professor Babalwa Magoqwana, who is the director for the Center for Women and Gender Studies at Nelson Mandela University. She is a former president of the South African Sociological Association from 2017 to 2019, and is an Erasmus Mundi Scholar, a presidential scholar with the University of Michigan. She is a fellow with the American Learned Societies Council's African Humanities Program, and a part of the South Africa's Department of Higher Education and Training Future Professors Program. She is the recipient of the National Research Foundation First Rand Foundation Sabbatical Grant for her project, which is groundbreaking, on building a woman-centered vernacular sociology. And her research, which is transforming sociology in South Africa, is on maternal legacies of knowledge, and has been supported by the National Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences. And her general work in sociology is in work, labor sociology, sociology of gender, service work, and indigenous knowledge systems. And then we have Professor Tshepo Madlingozi, who is a commissioner of the South African Human Rights Commission. His focal areas at the Commission are anti-racism, justice, and education. He has sat on several boards of civil society organizations, including the Rural Democracy Trust, Mining Affected Communities, United in Action, Women Affected by Mining, the Institute for Social Dialogue, the Socio-Economic Rights Institute of South Africa, Imbiza Journal of African Writing, the Center for Human Rights, the Zimbabwe Exiles Forum, University of Free State, Amandla.mobi, which is a very groundbreaking activist, digital activist site, Africa and the Africa Ikalafe Pluriversity. He was also a member of the steering committee of the African Coalition for Corporate Accountability, the Right to Protest Project Coalition, the advisory board for the Health Justice Initiative, and for 13 years he worked with the Kulumani Support Group, which is a human rights organization and social movement that represents victims and survivors of apartheid, and at some point litigated corporations that supported apartheid. In 2021 and 2022, he was the chief panelist for the South African Human Rights Commission of Inquiry into Racial Discrimination and Forms of Discrimination in Advertising. He's a visiting professor at the International Institute of Social Studies at the Erasmus University Rotterdam and a faculty member of the Vienna Master of Arts in Applied Human Rights. He's co-editor of the South African Journal on Human Rights, amongst many other important publications. Then we have Dr. Jenny du Preez, who has a PhD in literary studies in English and is currently the senior manager for programs for the chair for critical studies in higher education and transformation, what we call CriSHET at Mandela. And she's an active member of the Akuza Africa network of scholars and practitioners that are interested in critical university studies and other alternative and radical approaches to studying the university. Her research explores the representation of the university in South African fiction and how literature and literary studies might offer a disclosing critique of the social imaginary of the university. She's also interested in the representation of gender, sexuality, and literature from Africa and the diaspora, women's writing, and the erotic. So thank you to all the colleagues. I think we begin with Farouk. I'm not sure if I can see him. Farouk, maybe you want to put on your video, or we want to start with Babalwa?
Sorry, Nama, should we keep our videos open throughout?
Yes, yes, you must keep your videos open, please. Thank you. If I can also see Farouk, because yes, I think I can also add a spotlight. Okay, great. And Tshepo and Jenny. Thank you so much. Okay, so while we wait for Tshepo to come on board, there's Farouk inside your shop. Let's start with you, Farouk. If you can maybe just give us some opening lines. As Andre said, here, especially in this group, including with Tshepo, Jenny, and others, we've been thinking a lot about this beyond decolonization, you know, and I think maybe, Farouk, you can give us a start by telling us from a community activist point of view, a local activist who's also a small business owner going through it all economically. What's your view of the so-called decolonization debate in the universities, and if ever it was to be meaningful in Black community in particular, from your point of view, what do you think that really means?
Muted. Can you hear me? Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Prof, for allowing me the opportunity to speak here. So from the outside, from an outside view, from a community perspective, the term like decolonization and other social justice or radical discourses may appear as a response to address historical injustices, challenging existing powers, but and to promote inclusivity and equality with academic and society. It is seen as a attempt to diversify perspectives and knowledge systems. So from a community perspective, we have to look at the current structures that's in the university, especially when it comes to the power structures. We know the universities in the apartheid era were run mostly by white people, by the colonists, you know. And some of the challenges that we had when we were studying is there was no safe spaces for Black people to, you know, to express themselves, where they could speak. I remember when I was at it was called PE Technicon. On the walls when we were there, there was written there. I don't know if I can mention this, but it was written like derogatory things like "Go home, Black people," you know, you don't belong here. So we have to look at this thing holistically. I don't know how the university, the internal operation of the university is, but we need to make we have partnerships with local communities in terms of how we can work together with local communities when research is being done on indigenous knowledge, because we find from a community perspective that the university will send students and with no knowledge or historical knowledge of what this community is about, and they will gather information from these communities, indigenous knowledge from these communities, and then they will write dissertations and they will write articles and things without acknowledging the community, you know. Then the so-called glory will then go to that student, and he will get his PhD or his doctorate or whatever the case may be, and the communities will just be left behind, and then the university will send out other students again. I made this example about 4 years ago when I was speaking at the university, where the university sends out, the education department sends out students to our schools, which is the schools in the north, some of the schools, not all of them, in the northern areas at that time. And we know literacy is a problem at our schools. So when the university sends out their students, or the students apply at a certain school, I would call them, and excuse me for saying this, subpar students, because those students that can't get into the Model C schools for training purposes, they then come to our schools, and then they just carry on with what's currently happening in the schools. We know at our schools, most of the kids, they can't read. Up until now, since we started in 1999, we still have the same problem in 2024, where you get kids in grade 9, 10, 11, 12 that actually can't read. So literacy is a problem. And there's a lot of bureaucracy around. There's a lot of red tape, not only from a school point of view, but also from a departmental point of view. The Department of Education, you know, they have to fill in forms, they have to move on with their peers and things like that. So these are all the things that with the university, if we talk about decolonization, we have to kind of like address historical injustices that was done to our people, but we can do it in a radical way, or we can do it in a systemic, incremental way, like bit by bit, you know. And I love what the university was doing currently. I'm talking about Nelson Mandela University, where they are on a journey to work with the indigenous Khoi people, which is a great initiative. I am currently working for the Aboriginal Business Council as a founding member, where we, as the Aboriginal Business Council, we had a look at what's currently happening in South Africa, with all the corruption and state capture and things. The marginalized communities, which is the so-called colored communities. Some of us don't want to be called colored. Let us say the so-called indigenous or Aboriginal communities. They were marginalized when it comes to businesses. So the Aboriginal Business Council then was founded 10 months ago, and we went into the SOEs and negotiated with them. And most of those SOEs also needs to be decolonized, the same like the university. But personally, I don't think it should be we should have a radical approach to decolonization, because then we'll have a lot of fights. I think we should have a systematic, incremental approach where we do things bit by bit, you know.
If I can ask Farouk, do you say that because you think maybe the way universities have this discussion, it's almost like so academics write radically, but they don't think about how things are going to translate in reality. So when you're talking about having to deal with the fact that it's the same university that's sending subpar students over, that you've got so many different struggles around business, about all these different things that are hitting life right now. Are you saying, I mean, I'm just interpreting what you're saying is that it can only work if we're going to work on it incrementally, rather than assuming that we can have this radical conversation that's we're not going to get anyway.
That's correct, yes. You see, in our context, when I speak about our context, I'm talking about the South African context. It's a very difficult thing to do, because we were so brainwashed by the previous government that the so-called the colored people, the Aboriginal people, Khoisa and Korana, whatever you want to call yourself, we were actually brainwashed to think that we are better than the African people, the Xhosa people, the Zulu people, the Venda people. But in actual fact, we are just as black. We are just as black. We are also African. So it's very difficult to work around that dynamics, especially for an institution like the university, because you have to deal with all these different people with identity crises, and you have to deal with people with different economic backgrounds, because from our people, you do get the bourgeois that thinks they are better than us, but we look the same. You know what I'm saying? So it's a complex thing. You cannot have a single approach to solving this problem. That's why the university and all the different departments at the university needs to work together on this. And it starts from the guy hiring the cleaner to the guy hiring the professors. You know, we have to look at that, and we have to really think about also what is the demographics of the city that you are in, and employ people on an equity level in that sense as well. You know, but there's a big gap between what's happening in the areas where we stay and in other areas, because from the streets you will hear things like, for instance, especially with your university, yeah, we don't get transport to come to the university, but other people are getting picked up there in Constant with the buses. Why can't they send the bus to Clary Park or whatever the case may be? I don't know if it's true. There is just the nuances that goes around here. I'm not saying it is true or it is not true. I'm just mentioning to you what I've heard, and that is also creating like gaps between
Yes.
It's creating big division between people. But if we really talk about decolonization, then we also have to look at supporting indigenous and marginalized communities. So especially what the Nelson Mandela University is embarking on, to establish that partnership with indigenous communities and marginalized groups, to recognize their expertise, like we are doing now with the medicinal gardens and things like that, and to support their research agendas. I was always saying, you know, I had a saying when I was doing grassroots work. I had a saying where I said, if you want to know a community, go to that guy in the community that's always busy in the community, that's not getting funding, that's doing projects out of love. Go to that guy, because that is the guy that can tell you everything about that community. Don't bypass people, you know. Don't bypass people. If you want to start a garden and as a gardener, don't disrespect the gardener. Go to the garden and say, look, how can we work together to make this garden better? Because I've got the expertise of soil and plants and things, but you are the guy that's going to be here every day in this community. So how do we empower you, you know, to empower yourself, basically?
Okay.
Then also we also need to look at a curriculum reform, you know, especially for the university, where people are taught about indigenous cultures, and to foster that respect between students, even if it's on an informal basis, where you can say, okay, this one identify as a Khoi, this one identify as this, and there's a safe space for these people to go and be themselves, because there's a lot of people in our community currently that suffers from identity crisis, you know, especially youngsters. They are vulnerable. Then you've got your sorry your student support services. That's what I wanted to say. Student support services that they can actually provide better support for students in terms of those safe spaces that the university can create.
So, okay, just as we move to Tshepo, to bring Tshepo into the conversation, really what I'm hearing is you're saying there's a need to be realistic about the level of social division that actually exists.
That's
and
correct,
when you're speaking about decolonization, you're not talking in an empty space. And I appreciate that, because basically we were saying, in reality, especially in the South African context, we've got this apartheid legacy of divisions that were engineered amongst Black people themselves. So now you've got this contestation between the previously marginalized. So if you want to talk about decolonization in the actual reality, you need to think very clearly about what you mean to who. So, and just in the sense that this is the reality that people are currently, these are the realities people are dealing with. So you might think you're decolonizing, but you're finding yourself in a different kind of conversation when you turn to someone else. So with that, let me just move to bring Tshepo into the conversation and say, okay, Tshepo, okay, so we've heard Farouk saying there's a reality, and I think we can appreciate that level of difficulty in South Africa of having a cross-cutting conversation that can embrace the experiences of Blackness and being de-Blacked. I don't know how else to say it. de-blacked by the apartheid state and de-Africanized, actually. The de-Africanization of colored people in South Africa is a very big problem that it's kind of currently an issue we can't deal with. So I think perhaps you can come in here and talk. Firstly, I think let's go into the issue of your current critique of decolonization. And then I think later we'll bring in your question of your issue of how you see creolization as a potential way. But let's maybe hear your critique of the discourse. Yeah.
No, thank you so much, Prof. Mkhize. Good evening, colleagues. Now, first of all, let me just say that, I agree entirely with what Farouk was saying there. In 2006, almost 20 years ago, I published an article which the subtitle, Beyond the Ivory Tower, where, I was saying that as progressive scholars, the title is Progressive Academics and Politics Beyond the Ivory Tower, to say that if we are serious about progressive politics in the university, there's a need to embed ourselves in the struggles that are happening in communities. Because we might think that we are being radical, but actually we are reinforcing, the status quo. But also, just to go to Farouk's second point about how university students and academics parachute into communities, take knowledge, and then run away. My most cited article is from 2010, and it's called Transitional Justice Entrepreneurs. It's most cited because I speak about these issues about how, how do we do our work in a way that is not extractivist, that is, doesn't take from the communities, and just extract knowledge for our own professional, advancement. So just to say that I want to start by really acknowledging and emphasizing what Farouk was saying. So for me, my current critique, and it's become boring now because I tend to repeat it quite a lot. The first one was that, there was an attempt, or there is an attempt, to decolonize universities without dismantling institutional cultures. So you've got two processes going at the same time. You've got decolonial attempt. At the same time, you've got a deepening neoliberal institutionalization, a deepening corporatization of the university, where academics are expected to be publication machines, just publish, where, they are expected to get a lot of money through grants and so forth, where they're expected to compete, with one another. So you are grafting a decolonial ethos in the context of neoliberalism and managerialism. And all universities in South Africa are facing that problem, which is that, decolonize, but within managerial framework, within a neoliberal framework. That's not going to work. In fact, that's why we see decolonization, therefore, being management speak, being domesticated, being public relations, and so forth. The second one, of course, related to that is on the side of the students, which is that, I think there was a bit of naivety from some of the students that you could decolonize universities without decolonizing society. I mean, that, cannot happen. So students, of course, did talk about insourcing, meaning that, so-called support staff must be full-time, meaning that they combine issues of students and workers, which was very, very good. But as far as what happens after 3 years of study, after 4 years of study, a lot of us still have notion of upward mobility, socio-economic climbing, no one trying to commit, class suicide. So I will disrupt the university, but after that, I'll go on as a lawyer, work at a very commercial law firm, to make money. And there are complex reasons there because, some people are first-generation scholars, so one emphasize. But the idea that you can decolonize for 3 years, but then afterwards join the class of the bourgeois, that was limitation. but also in terms of the emancipatory horizon from the student side, that was not clear. What is this decolonization meant to achieve? And that takes me to the third point, which is related to what Farouk was saying. You know, part of the cul-de-sac with decolonization, or part of the contradiction with decolonization, was that it was not clear what is the emancipatory horizon. Where are we going with this? So people would say things like, you know, our main aim is to retrieve native discourse. You can't make that your emancipatory horizon, your liberation aim, when we know that the native only comes into being when the settler arrives. So what do you mean when you say, I want to be native again? I want to retrieve native discourse. I'll go even further to say some of, or the majority of the decolonial critique from students and from academics actually fell into a colonialist discourse, a colonialist discourse that drove very clear lines between black and white, you know, to say, you know, we want to be black again, when we know that race is created in order to, you know, divide people and in order to create hierarchies. That cannot be your decolonial horizon, you know, really reinscribing colonial discourse. So there were those problems, but also a problem of history. You know, a lot of discourse very, very ahistorical, shockingly ahistorical. And because they're ahistorical, they end up parachuting in discourse from Latin America, discourse from Black America, because there's no understanding of our deep history, complex history that Farouk was talking about, a history really about interculturality, that there's no going back, you know, and so forth. So really, one does not want to be quite harsh, because the movement, you know, has a place. The movement still has a reason to exist, but you know, the friendly critique was all this cul-de-sac, all this naivety, and lastly, a very aggressive kind of approach. You know, I don't see Ubuntu in some of this discourse. Very aggressive, very divisive. Yes, of course, you have to be divisive, but you know, our culture teaches us that Ubuntu or humaneness is both the means and the end. You can't say, you know, so that's why even for the Fees Must Fall students, within the students, there was a lot of sexual harassment, a lot of homophobia, a lot of class contradictions, and so forth, because there was no attempt to build beloved communities. Yeah.
I think I just wanted you, I think I want to save you the issue of the, I mean, you're calling it creolization, but I know what you're saying. You're saying we need to move beyond the colonial construct of race. So I want us to come back to that at the end, when I come back to everyone towards the end. I want to ask you to, maybe for the benefit of our colleagues, you speak about the ahistorical, maybe I'm just a historian, but the ahistorical nature of some of our debate in South Africa. So before I move to Babalwa, I wanted you to just elaborate a bit on that, because I think that has been quite a key part of your critique, because it's a tension, it's a global, inter-global South tension, this one. And I think since we're doing a global South meeting, I think we need to put to that sharpness here and say, well, why would the South African or African context critique some of the imported Black experiences and also subaltern experiences of other places? Why do we critique that thing here?
Yeah.
Or anyway, I mean, please go into that.
Yeah, so the starting point is, of course, white supremacy is global, that colonialism was a global experience, and therefore the Black experience will be similar, you know, to a large extent. We talk about the Black Atlantic, for example. We know about exchanges from the 18th century between South Africans, so-called South Africans, and other Black people, you know, in other parts of the world. So one is not saying that one must be provincial. There is something called the Black global experience. there is something about the British imperialism that was almost similar in the other parts of Africa, in other parts of Asia and so forth. So one can see some of the similarities, and one can draw from that similarities. However, and without being exceptionalist, as far as the South African Express is concerned, we don't want to be exceptionalist. The first conflict between white people and black people in South Africa is 1510, right? 1510, then we have 1652, where with the arrival of white people and so forth. In most of Africa, colonialism starts and lasts for only about 6 years. For us, it's that much, from 1652. So when one borrows from other parts of Africa, how much are we missing when we do that? That's the first thing, right? That the longue durée of our history is very, very unique. Secondly, we had Dutch colonialism, then we had English colonialism. Both very, very different in terms of what they wanted to achieve, what kind of natives they produced, So, for example, people will say to me, the missionaries were at the heart of the colonial experience. That's not true. In South Africa, the missionaries come later than colonialism, unlike in other parts of Africa, where the missionaries prepare the ground. Here, our missionaries come at the later stage and so forth. So when you say things like that about the role of missionaries, the role of anthropologists, very, very different in the South African context from what happened in Latin America, what happened in other spaces. Thirdly, the kind of the black elites that were produced in South Africa, who, of course, one would say, they aspire towards European modernity, European modernity, that they were Amakola, converted, Europeanized, and so forth. Just like in other parts of Africa, just like in Latin America, just like in Black, but you will soon see that you are making a mistake. Our South African black elites were still very much rooted in their traditional experience. They could not dislocate and become completely assimilated. So when people talk about the experience of assimilation in Portuguese Africa, in Latin America with the mestizos and so forth, we have a different type of black elites. And because we're a different kind of black elites who, yes, Europeanized, but still rooted in their traditional communities, especially with the advent of apartheid, which draws sharp restrictions. It produced different types of politics, which therefore, when we say the decolonial project is still an unfinished business, because 1994 did not produce liberation and emancipation. We say, why is that the case? Is it because our black elites were assimilated, were Europeanized? No, that's not the case. It's very, very complex. So history matters quite a lot, because the question of decolonization is a question of history, to say we need to decolonize because of what happened in the past. But if you just import uncritically, Edward Said talks about, say, can theory travel? And of course, theory can travel, but there are certain conditions to say theory can travel. So I've been very, very much concerned, especially in my little field of law, and so forth, where we're not taught history. People make a lot of assumptions about how did we get this constitution. People conflate apartheid and colonialism. Of course, it's romantic to say colonialism and apartheid were the same. No, they were not the same. They were not the same. So history matters here.
Thanks. Actually, that links back to what Farouk is actually saying, which is we've got a very nuanced situation happening right now, particularly in the, in relation to how universities are going to deal with the new, not new, but the new sort of emphasis on the ancestral, the descendants of ancestral Africans who were made into coloreds. So there's a whole nuance there in South Africa that it doesn't negate anywhere else, but it's just about, if we are talking, we need to be clear about the context. which may be somewhat different in Latin America, maybe. And in Latin America, you may have, I mean, I don't know, but I've put the question, and maybe the colleagues can respond, but I've put the question about why so many seemingly white Latin American scholars talk and fewer, we hear fewer indigenous scholars on some of these topics, and whether it matters or not in Latin America. It would matter here, but I don't know if it matters in Latin America. So let's move to Babalwa quick, just to bring you in now. Babalwa, your work has been about making concepts and also addressing what is the horizon that Tshepo was mentioning here. So please, can you just give us a sense of your work, perhaps whether you have your own critiques or your own contributions in terms of the discourse.
Okay. No, thank you so much, Nomalanga. Thank you so much, colleagues. Appreciate the space. Just first thing, before I can come to what I do and how I approach things, I think that there's a conversation maybe where you can park it for later on. The kind of criticism that I think could be very unfair for the expectation of a student to do all of these things that we think as adults we should have done. The expectation that the university must be everything to everyone. The expectation that you can't decolonize and still want money in the corporate sector. So those are the contradictions that we live with. But I think that there's too much of a burden for a student in a university doing a third year to be expected to conceptualize decolonization to a point that they must imagine this emancipatory project until the end, even though they were pushed by the experience of being pressed and feeling like an outsider. That is the point I think that we need to start from. That when you are pushed into a corner as a student, you don't have any theory backing you, but you are relying only on your experience. And you say, this is not normal. It's not normal that I cannot see the people who look like me. It's not normal that I can have a history that does not have me in it. It's not normal that I have the aesthetics, the architecture of the space that I'm in that is not even resembling what I know as knowledge. But so what I'm trying to say is that let's just be careful, colleagues. And also, precarity is a real thing. Capitalism has pushed all of us into a corner that most of the time we have to make compromises and concessions our ideas so that we can survive, because ultimately the global financial space is literally wiping almost everything and everyone out, including nature for that matter. So what I'm trying to say, when we're talking about these contradictions and the expectations of what could this project could have achieved, I think we need to be kinder to ourselves. This is a project that the imperialists took 400-500 years. You can't dismantle it between 2015 and 2017. It's impossible. So that's the first part. The second part is, I agree with you, Farouk, that sometimes the relationship between the university and the community becomes very problematic. But I don't want us to pose questions when it comes to the denial of the citizenship of the students in the community. So we can't assume that the student does not come from that community, even though they have studied the community. So there is that dual thing that is happening. In as much as, yes, they must be ethical about the community, they can't assume that they are all knowing. They must be ethical about how they do research. They must be respectful to the norms and the ways in which communication runs in the communities. But we cannot assume that the student is an outsider. So those are the two things that I think might be, when we think about decolonization, which is, I think, for me, it is still a big project. When I was traveling outside Africa, I must say outside Africa in different continents, as an African in those spaces, you still feel, again, I'm talking about the experience, you still feel the negativity, the fact that the African is still the other. And you still have to explain yourself, what are you doing here? So in as much as in South Africa, we have come to have a decolonization fatigue, the people who are outside South Africa, decolonization means something else. Yes, we can argue here about conceptual differences. We can argue here about the emancipatory route that we should take. But if Africa is still perceived as a continent, diaspora and everything, is still perceived in such a negative and extractive and very, as if there's nothing that comes from Africa. I think as South Africans, we are too hard on ourselves. Most of the time, if you talk to any South African across the globe, you'll be told by someone else outside that actually you guys are doing well. And then you're like, what? We're not doing well. We are too hard. We are used to that. That is the culture that we're coming from. However, what I'm saying is, if we have not even begun to dig on our conceptual and philosophical meanings of what makes, for example, society, it is what I'm trying to understand in sociology. What makes this society a society, Africa? What are the things that makes us peculiar in our philosophy and offer the world? Because the criticism by Paul Hontonji, Jimmy Adeshina, recently, Bongani Nyoka, and others, Zeleza and others, about, you know what, Africa, for others, I was in a university whereby everyone is studying Africa and none of them are Africans. So, I'm not saying that you should be just because you're in Africa. Where Africa is still the data collection site, even today, I'm not saying 1963, I'm talking about Africa. Even for Africans who are in the diaspora or China, wherever, they still treat Africa as a data collection site that has no value philosophically and in terms of theory making. So what I'm saying is, in as much as we want to be hard on what this project could have been and should be, but we must still keep in mind that there's a context specificity that we need to keep in mind about how we translate the failures or what could have been lost and how much we could have gained. Colleagues, we still have in South Africa less than 7% of our academic professorate being African women. Tell me, what are we doing? So we cannot, this was we are confronted with the real issues today. We are confronted by the fact that the student that does not have food at our university, we know that, who the student is. We know when we are saying unemployed, rural, we already know who that person is. But the problem for me is that as academics, we want also to kind of, I don't want to say, perceive and shape things in a certain way rather than the actual reality of what is happening in the ground. And the students are feeling the pain. They are feeling their own experiences. So we cannot, therefore, reduce that experience to something that we think ought to have been. It is always muddy. It is always complicated. It is always ongoing. It is a work in progress. I don't think we're going to get to a destination and say, whew, thank God, we decolonized in 2015. It's not going to happen. So what I'm saying is, basically what I'm doing, what I've tried to do in my own little corner, building from the traditions of African women and the African thinkers across the globe, to say that what are the traditions that have informed our understanding of this coloniality of power, as Kujano says. How did this power that we are trying to grapple with, and how did our own grandmothers come to understand and be so resilient under such excruciating circumstances? maybe there's something that we can take from those wisdom and apply in our classrooms, because the socio-economic condition is so crushing that when you're trying to think philosophically, you're like, oh, stomach, but it. So that is what I'm trying to do. But within sociology, because I cannot claim to do it for other disciplines, social sciences and mostly sociology, because I do believe that there is value in a context-specific historical analysis of each society. So that's what I'm trying to do. But I hope I didn't take too much of your time, Nomala.
I was hoping maybe you would get then into some of the work on the concepts, maybe just a brief thing before we move on to Jenny. You said something, it was context specific. It's very resonant what Tshepo was saying, and even Farouk, context specific, historically, there was an English word there, context specific, historically something. If you can just maybe tell us a bit about your work here.
Okay, so basically what I've tried to do, I'll speak about my recent paper that I published. What I've tried to do was to say that we can't have an Africa that is so rich in philosophy, so rich in the values of what it offers, and the Africa that has never treated a woman in the manner that it treats it now. You know, being the face of sociology, basically, globally. What is it that we offer? And then I said, definitely there's something unique about the African societies. One, they've got whether you are, all the way from Cape to Cairo, Africa shares one of the most consistent philosophies, Ubuntu. Okay, that is the concept that I've used, humanity, but I link it to the idea of being a human being, umntu, which is a non-gendered conception of being. And then I link that to the idea of uluntu, which is society, humanity. And I say that if you then look at how you bring those things together, you understand that for us, the whole thing about the individual at the center of the Western modern society, it was actually the opposite. The fact that the woman took a central stage in the conception of family and household. You can go from West Africa to East Africa, Southern Africa. The woman was at the center of social organization, of how the household functioned. Hence, social reproduction was managed by these sometimes senior women. And then the last concept the two concepts, the concept of umakhulu, the elderly woman or the grandmother. I say that there's something about the grandmother that pours and transfers knowledge that would not otherwise get in the. And I say that there's something that is what is called the likes of Giddens and others talks about the sociological imagination, where she trains people through clan names as well, you know, to understand history, imvelaphi, and origins. And I also say there is something about the power that is invested in the eldest daughter in the African household, which is umafungwashe. The eldest daughter, I always make an example of the paper that we co-wrote with Uspokazi and Motseme, where umakazi Mandela, Omowa, the first daughter of the first wife of Nelson Mandela. Umakazi says, you know what, Mandla, I am the one who is senior in this household. And the grandson, Nomandla Mandela, says, no, I am actually Inkulu because I am the son. But when you look at tradition, you know, you look at seniority, how it is explained within the African households, you realize that women, due to the power that they had in their natal household, there was a way of negotiating power, and the gender in itself of the being of the person was secondary. So therefore, you can't, by the virtue of being male in African households, say that you've got authority or you've got power over women, over other bodies within the house. So I'm trying to excavate those concepts and say, how do we deal with the issues of pronouns when we don't have pronouns, for example? Do you get
No,
it?
we don't.
So that is basically the work that I'm doing, and I'm hoping that it can contribute to this retrieval, to this reconstruction, reconstruction, so that we know that, okay, we have a point of reference as Africans. People who said we don't have history, they are actually lying. And last thing, Nomalanga, the fact that we are dealing with white hegemonic intellectual culture, it requires that we do this thing. It is the only weapon that we have, history. You know, as Tshepo said. But anyway, that is the kind of work that I'm doing, and we'll take questions later.
I must say your work on uMakhulu has been groundbreaking in South Africa. If people haven't come across Babalwa's work, I don't know how, Jenny, it can be shared. But the work on the maternal sociological institution of the grandmother is so, I know it's not the first time that African women have written in this way, but for South African sociology and in terms of reinvigorating that old question of that African feminists have been writing about the matriarchal, and reaffirming that, especially when you say we are dealing with the hegemony of white intellectual discourse, right down to language. I really, really don't understand why the rest of us must be put in a situation where we must be dominated by English thinking to the degree that the left, I'm sorry, believes that we must be told about pronouns when our languages don't have these things. And nobody on the American left is critiquing this nonsense by saying, guys, everywhere in the world, people are learning to speak English by force. And you guys are not even having to learn any other language. And you want this to be the politics of the day. So that reminds me of this thing of importing struggles that actually belong in corners of other parts of the world, and then having to de-emphasize the struggles that we are currently facing that are also as complex. And so as a non-English speaker, I'm now forced to go into something I don't care about because somebody else is making me care about it. But that's another, but in fact, it's very important because these are the hegemonic problems that then stymie the debate. And I think that's where Tshepo was going, is that you end up going into cul-de-sacs. You end up going into corners that you're not, well, maybe he has a different view on this particular issue, but I'm just saying that it can lead us into corners. And maybe as I come back to you, Tshepo, later, just respond to some of the stuff Babalwa had said, and also just how to untangle those tensions of what's needed, but also how what's needed also creates tension. Jenny, I just want to bring you in here to sort of round us off. You are obviously working for the chair, so you are a kind of an institutional person. So perhaps you can talk about I mean, I know you're positioned strangely in the chair, but the chair is a driver in the university, not a driver like with the stick, obviously, but like it's an advocate rather. And I think I'd like to hear from you what the experience has been from an institutional point of view. And of course, there are limits to what chairs and institutions can do, but just let us know what the work of the chair is and how you've been dealing with all this complexity.
Thanks, Norma. Yeah, so I'm in the chair for critical studies in higher education transformation. Andre Kit is the chair, and he's also the DVC of the engagement and transformation portfolio at Nelson Mandela University, which was established in around 2019. So the university basically made this organizational redesign decision to have a whole portfolio based on engagement and transformation. And within that, and within the chair, the questions of decolonization, Africanization are central. And so often the kind of work we try and do is to provide spaces, to be coordinative, to be facilitative. So we generally have a lot of seminar series. So like we hosted the Beyond Decolonization Roundtable, for example, that you and Tshepo were involved in. But I think there's still been that question of, okay, we have this portfolio that needs to grapple, like is there to coordinate and facilitate these questions of transformation, engagement, decolonization, Africanization, questions of gender and sexuality and so on. But how do you do that throughout the institution in a meaningful way? Because it's tended to, these debates, discussions, practices have tended to happen in siloed ways and sometimes are often kind of like limited to certain disciplines or areas rather than having a kind of institutional thrust. I was reading Janssen and Walter's The Decolonization of Knowledge, and they talk about how in response to the Fees Must Fall movement and Roads Must Fall movements, there was an attempt at an institutional, or at least in many universities, there was an attempt at an institutional response to decolonize, to the call for decolonization. And that at Senate level, there was things drafted potentially, but that never made its way into the faculties in any meaningful way. It just became part of the reporting regime. So yeah, at the chair and in ETP, we trying to think about, okay, there's almost like been this way in which the project has become hollowed out. And the approach to sort of the top-down approach to trying to embed an engagement with the questions of decolonization throughout the institution have kind of failed from a certain approach. And I think we can also see the limits of policy and compliance type regimes within the institution as well in terms of making meaningful change. So we kind of tried to experiment, I suppose, with finding ways to like deal with these complex issues, to try and get us somewhere more productive, rather than say in the cul-de-sacs that Tshepo talks of. So one of our recent experiments, an example, in inverted commas, or explorations, was to try and take a sort of solidaristic and relational approach. So we tend to have this, and I think this resonates with, I think, a lot of what everyone here has been saying about humaneness and Ubuntu, and even like the way in which the like the question of institutional cultures, how that has basically put people in a corner, to borrow a phrase from earlier, where the sense of community within the institution and those relationships as being productive and solidaristic has slowly been whittled away. Obviously, the forms of collegiality that existed and in South Africa's history also obviously deeply problematic. Sorry, my light is a problem. So basically, in the face of all these complex issues and serious systematic and systemic constraints, like, what do you do? So one of our recent experiments was to host or to organize an Africanization decolonization with Indaba within the university at Nelson Mandela University. So instead of being a conference of people who necessarily work in these areas specifically, we wanted to try and create a space for as many people from as many different spaces in the university as possible to come together to share the work they're doing, that they see as resonating with the question of decolonization and Africanization. And we managed to have representatives from all 7 faculties. We had past staff, representatives from HR, a number of student leaders, and so on. So obviously, any attempt to be representative is bound to, has its limitations. But I think the productive aspect was to, one, have people in this conversation that normally don't ever join these conversations. So, start to connect some of the pockets, but also things like, the sciences, the hard sciences, so-called hard sciences, where people don't normally engage, or aren't known for engaging in this work, to see kind of how they're approaching things, and just to have them in the space to discuss it. So that was kind of the approach. We also asked for people to present their work in various modalities. They were free to have conversations, to present in standard academic ways, to share artworks, videos, and so on. So to try and like open up the ways in which they could engage in the conversation. And yeah, I think another productive aspect of it was that in a way it provided us with a snapshot in inverted commas, of kind of where the university is at in terms of thinking these things through, in terms of the work that's being done, to get a sense kind of where we are. And now, of course, the question is, based on this, what do we do next? You know, that hopefully leads to something productive for the university's institutional culture, as well as for real change within the disciplines, and also obviously institutionally in both material and other ways. I think I'll stop there for
Yes,
now.
if I could just say, yeah, quickly, maybe just make a comment about, as you're talking, I'm realizing that so it's a tension maybe that everyone must think about, because on the one hand, there's pressure to say the institution must respond to this challenge, but the moment the institution responds, it's doing so in that neoliberal fashion that Tshepo spoke about. So I sense that perhaps what CriSHET has done is try to avoid being, because it's scholarly, it's avoided being a institutionalized thing, but built enough relations so that there's enough goodwill for people across the space. I think if we maybe just briefly say something about, I realize now that CriSHET also does a lot of I don't know what to say, but it's like I don't want to say it's a catalyst, but there's a lot of students that are in that space. And it's almost like a pressure valve from the rest of the institution. So it's a space that's got enough undefinedness, such that when there is a hungry student, that's where we're going to send them. When there is a student who's in distress, so you are a chair, but I'm going to call and say, Jenny, my student has no way to stay. So there is something there that I'd like you to maybe just briefly describe how that experience of being a catch-all for the multiplicity of the crisis, but at the same time then leading the discussion on decolonization.
Yeah, there was something right at the beginning that you said that I wanted to touch on. Now I've kind of just about what you were saying about the call for the institution to respond, but then when it tending to respond in sort of this managerialist type way. And I think that was one of the interesting things that happened in the Indaba, is a lot of people spoke about the university and the institution as complete, in a way in which it was completely separate from themselves. So people who study and work within the institution were framing it as like they didn't have any ownership of it, although I'm not sure if I like that term, but like there wasn't a sense that they themselves were part of the university and were constituting the university as much, maybe not as much, obviously there's power differentials, but there was no sense of the constrained agency they maybe had, and there was sort of this vague idea of this institution that was kind of almost impersonal. And obviously neoliberal institutions, I think, kind of try and create that space. But again, it's sort of a sense of a lack of connection and relationality amongst the people within the institution. Yeah, and you can see it in sort of the silos that build up and the various narratives that people have about people in different spaces because they never connect with them. I think you see it even in sometimes in some departments where like those connections that potentially can provide solidarity for productive work disintegrate. And I think in the chair, in a way, that's some of our work, apart from, you know, the more traditional scholarly stuff, is really just that approach to, I'm not sure necessarily how to explain it, because it's one of these softer things that I find, you know, you don't actually have the right words for. But I suppose that idea that scholarship and practice are always intertwined. Yeah. And if you're going to be trying to drive transformation in various ways, perhaps at institutional levels, but also in those personal ways. So we might not, as a chair, have the institutional power to put in place the institutional measures that need to be done to deal with student hunger. We can't necessarily change the decolonized society, but in the relationships we have, in the connections that we have, we can provide that little that little space. Andre often talks about it as, he's talked about it as a holding space, but this idea that we can be not necessarily a catch-all, because I think also Babalwa was saying what we can expect from like a university. There's obviously just resource constraints. But yeah, I mean, I must say, as working there, I think that sense of connection and like this flexible space that also allows for, yeah, just like interactions and relationships between people from kind of, I don't know, from all spaces in the institution, on a different level. So it's not a lecturer-student relationship necessarily. So yeah, I think I'm like rambling a little bit, because I think I lack the words to quite explain.
Well, we have to, because I think that's what in every context, there's this space that's unable to be described, that's doing the work. That's where the model somewhat comes from. So let me allow everyone just a minute each or a sentence each to respond to anything, or just to go back to the three speakers, just to say, can you quickly respond, Farouk, to anything that you needed to respond to, just as we move towards the engagement with the rest of the colleagues. Thanks, Farouk. Do you need to unmute? Can you unmute? Yeah, sharp.
Yeah. I'm just going to use my time to use a quote from one of my favorite poets, where she says, it's Audre Lorde, and she says, there's no such thing as a single issue struggle, because we don't live single issue lives. And that's all I have to say.
Thanks. Tshepo, just a responsive engagement.
No, thank you so much to Farouk, Babalwa, and Jean. Yeah, no, I agree with Babalwa that we are not putting everything on the students. The question to me was, what are some of my critiques of decolonization approach, such as focus on the critiques? I mean, as I said, number one, that, you know, there's still a deep need to do this work. We are not where we need to be, you know. But number two, that, you know, as we do so, let's be honest about some of the cul-de-sac that we are facing. And, you know, I empathize a lot with managers, you know, and institutions or centers that are trying to do this work. You know, you try to do this work, but you are also expected to raise funds. But it's also a pressure from the whole institution for you to be this beacon that gives everything to everyone, you know. So really, you know, I've been there with CriSHET, and I know what they're really trying to do, you know. But my last thing to say is, you know, I hope we'll come back to some of the questions that Farouk was raising around, you know, the issues of who are we, you know, the identity, you know. There is a cliche about decolonizing our minds. I don't think we've done that enough. You know, we can't talk about decolonization and do the work unless we've decolonized ourselves. How will that look like? Who are we? Are we Zulu? Are we Sotho? Are we Africans? Are we Umuntu, as Abantu, as Babalwa was saying? So the project of an individual, inner, deeper, painful, you know, deeper, dealing with your own internalized patriarchy, internalized homophobia, internalized racism, internalized ableism. Where is that in this, you know, project that we're talking about? So I hope we'll be able to circle back. Thank you.
Thanks, Babalwa. Anything to add in response? Yeah.
Yeah, not really in response, but just to one, the issue that you mentioned, Nomalanga, I think the issue of vernacular is very important. I think it is one of the things that we have tried to use to access different ways of knowing and different ways of being. so that we can start the reconstruction process. And but anyway, I think most of the people that are here are familiar with the history of how the vernacular was used within the continent, and also specifically within South Africa, to kind of propel the society in a different kind of modern world as well. But also what happens is, when you access the vernacular, you begin to disentangle the idea of sexuality, spirituality, and gender. Okay, where if you are using the vernacular, gender fluidity becomes the norm.
The norm.
For example, the norm. Okay. But I would not go as far as Norma and say that pronouns are yeah, but what I'm saying is, I know what you mean. Just for the sake of the people that here, the fact that Africa tends to be extremely homophobic, it becomes crucial that we work with some of the concepts that we have already in our language, but also align sometimes with what is happening in society at that time. Because currently we're dealing with extreme religiosity in Africa. We are dealing with extreme homophobia, extreme religiosity, which are things that are not inherently there if you are using the vernacular. Okay? God is God, is not a she God or ye God. Whether you are saying in Swahili, Yoruba, or Xhosa, do you get it? So those kind of values attached to the vernacular can begin to help us with these issues of pronouns and all of that. So that's what I was trying to say. If you are inherently gender fluid because you, for example, you have an ancestor inside you that is a male, but you are bodily presenting as female, therefore, or you are male and you're bodily presenting as female, we have to call you Baba. And then people are confused, but why are you calling this person Baba? But they are looking in a particular way because that belongs to father. So those are the things that I think there's a potential that we can start this work of reintroducing ourselves to the world in our own terms. That's what I'm trying to do.
Yes.
Reintroducing ourselves in our own terms, not in the imported frameworks, or what Jimmy Desina calls protest scholarship or regurgitation. We're not here to regurgitate. We're not here to protest all the time, but we're here to build concepts that our students can begin to say, I know Utabao. That's why my uncle would relate like this to my mother, because uncle in isiXhosa is umalume, you know? So is the mother in the absence of the mother. Okay, I can explain, but direct translation is different. So what I'm trying to say is there's a potential there that we can always reconstruct differently. The last part is the issue that I think Jenny started talking about, issue of community, that I think Nomalanga, myself, other colleagues from different spaces, we have tried to kind of build using the sense of community, which was used, if you're looking at, there's a book that is recently released, it's called The Sisterhood. I've been enjoying it. It talks about these beautiful literature, Toni Morrison, the Four Sisters, some people will know here, that changed the Black literature, both in the diaspora and even here. You know, so they trace the kind of community that they built at a particular time and made deliberate decisions on how to write about Black American cultures. So that is the deliberate effort that we have been trying to instill and also to use with the likes of Obo Dalin, Nomalanga, and others, to build a community that we can think with, but also that we can challenge each other with. And then we take the project. I like the quote there by Adra Lode in that book, where she said sometimes we would fight, but our fight, we knew that we were fighting in the same side. All of us were in the same side, even though we fought as a community. So there is a potential in the community strategy that we all can take in dealing with the process of reconstruction and building our communities and our institutions. Otherwise, this is my take all the time. I think that our institutions currently, higher education institutions, are going to collapse, colleagues, because of the inherent problems that we have in our society in South Africa right now, and Africa for that matter. Ultimately, we are faced with a very dim future where the institutions will collapse simply because they are responsive in certain parts of things. I'm not saying they're responsive to everything, because they choose when to respond, even institutions themselves. So when there's that response, then the society or the community pushes towards that response because they've given up on municipalities. They've given up on our government. They've given up on everything else. So the institutions that tend to respond, they become the points of contention and targets. And this is the kind of balance that sometimes I always say we need to strike and think as a community, all of us, and say, how do we protect what is working while we push for other institutions to start working to balance the society? There is no society that has ever worked with only higher education institutions as the only option for it. There's never been in the history of any society. You can't depend on higher education as the only exit out of poverty, like what we have done in South Africa. So I'll just end it there, Nomalanga. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can I invite, I don't know if there's questions on the chat. Oh, I see Frank. Oh, everyone is direct messaging me. Why is nobody emailing to the everyone in meeting? Are we allowed to invite message? Was it questions? Frank or Juan? Can a society thrive and flourish when its people are held captive by Eurocentrism or neocolonialism? Apiwe Mamepodla, 2 questions. What policy reforms are needed to advance decolonization? How can government institutions support initiatives promoting indigenous knowledge? We don't hear a lot from government when it comes to the decolonization project. Colleagues, I don't know if I want you to just switch on your, what do you call them, the video. I can remove spotlight, maybe. Will that make things easier so we can see each other as a group? Remove spotlight. Now I'm spotlighted. How do I remove my spotlight? Maybe I can ask people to put on their videos and just have a chat. Shirley, Manisha, thanks, colleagues. Yeah, I think there's been a lot put on the table here that's quite challenging. And as Babalwa says, it's very true. We may be fighting and debating, but we're fighting and debating on the same side. So I'd like to invite that. Andre, sorry, I'm just going through the Zoom window here.
Manisha's hand is
okay,
up.
Manisha, go ahead. Yes, I see your hand. We can go ahead.
I am very, very grateful. I can't tell you it is like music to hear each one of you present. It's like freedom. All education institutions are in the same situation. And I like what Ms. Babalwa, you mentioned. These education institutions are in crisis. It's not just the open education movement. I'm Manisha, and I work with in Alberta with First Nations, the Indigenous people. It's First Nations College, Muscogee's Cultural College, which is on a reserve. So all tribal people. But there is resiliency. Each and every word which was saying applies to this. It is global. It's universal. It applies to this context. And it's like a movement. I want to invite all of you to do this present. I know the recording is there, but the power of being live is more powerful, I think. Presenting live and listening to present again together, or 2 people together. the way it would work, I'm going to share my email address in chat. I'd like to say that it was so fascinating. It's like music for my soul, for my spirit, that people are passionate, this activism and the realities. We speak about pluralism, multiple realities, and you touched on so many different topics. Like, who are we? Like, I'm from India. Am I a racialized settler? I work with indigenous people. My children are born in Canada, and languages. You've touched on so many issues. Hegemony. Hegemony is there everywhere. So I have a question, and this is for all of you. So as marginalized, people, I'm a Canadian citizen on paper. I have a Canadian passport, but I was born in India. My question is, how do we deal with our own internal leadership structures and politics? Because they are doing what they are doing to survive too. They have to survive themselves. Lateral violence and nepotism. It's not just the intergenerational trauma or the colonizers' work, but internally, how do we deal with those issues with power, and keep on doing the good work, to make sure that our students are benefiting? Because what we are doing is we are creating leaders. Leaders need leaders, and powerful, stable, free people, because people are the ones who will take the movement forward. My question is, so how do you deal with politics, drama, lateral violence, nepotism? Because when people come in power, maybe this is what colonizers have taught, there is a separate space which is for the elite. And if within indigenous people, we are going to have this elite circle, like you scratch my back, I scratch my back with politics or whatever, or just listen to me and do not contribute, like that's a colonized culture, or paternalistic approach, then how do we deal with it? Like, I'm really speaking this in context with any change we are doing in the organization, such as using open education resources, open education. The more people we educate, and then this push approach internally within our own organizations. So right now, the virus is not the COVID virus, which is outside or epidemic. It's the internal pandemic, which is there within organizations. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. More contributions, colleagues. I don't know how to ask people to put up Jean, or is it Jean? Do you want to say your comment? Or Jessica? Thanks, Jessica. You can go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. Ooh, let me just switch on my video. I have a comment rather than a question. Thank you, everybody, for your insight, valuable information shared. What I found myself as a lecturer, also in a tertiary institution, is that it's almost as if the structure of the tertiary education system favors written knowledge versus oral history, embodied knowledge, and the various forms that indigenous knowledge comes in. So I wonder if it's a question of eventually the tertiary education system being reimagined to value the various forms that indigenous knowledge comes in. So that's my comment, rather. Thank you.
Where are you from? Sorry, what institution?
WITS. I taught at WITS.
Yes.
Specifically,
yes. In what
theatre and
discipline?
performance.
Oh,
theatre and performance.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, and you found it difficult in theatre and performance even to, or maybe
so in theatre and performance, it's straightforward in the teaching type of realm, because you can incorporate those elements into the way that you teach. So you can incorporate case studies, the knowledge can be embodied, you can practice it, but in terms of, this emphasis on publication. So I wonder if there are other ways for the university system as a whole to kind of have more emphasis on the various things. I know now there's things like creative outputs, and the Department of Higher Education and Training, introducing, creative outputs and the value of creative output. Mm-hmm. But it still seems, I still have the sense that there's a big emphasis on things that are written, even references that you refer students to, you are referring them to a journal, to a publication. It's only if you take the initiative as the lecturer to say, okay, what does this particular thing look like in your context as an individual? So that's just my contribution to the conversation. Thank you.
Okay. Apiwe.
Nkosi Prof. Nomalanga Mkhize. I think for Rimna, I'm captured from your contribution, Babalwa Magoqwana, when you say Africa is red, rather is used as a mine for data. And this is a point of departure for me. I currently teach social work at the Northwest University, and this is what I'm currently struggling with even in South Africa, because our approaches in social work are not humanizing, especially with the people that we work with. And I'm teaching first year's history or introduction to social work, and engaging with the curriculum because I found it there. I realized that the voices of people that look like me are not there. Not anywhere do they speak, for example, about Oprah Gibson Kent, who contributed immensely in the work of social work, but social work that is different, using the philosophy of the theater of the oppressed. Umamu Elon Kuzwayo, Joshua Nkomo in South Africa and in Zimbabwe, and other people who were social workers by occupation, not necessarily by training. Because also my view is that I need and we need to interrogate what is social work in Africa, in South Africa, because when we loosely translate it, we say inhlalonhle. But when you put it back into English, it doesn't fit as inhlalonhle, because inhlalonhle simply means living well. But the kind of social work that we practice, that I've seen in the communities and that we teach to students, it is alienating to the young people that we teach, and we expect them to be able to resolve the issues that communities experience and resolve these issues with communities. But the very education that we're teaching is, giving these students a particular, perhaps different position than their communities. So I'm still, grappling with these issues in my own corner, and with the understanding that the university exists within a community, but we seldom engage and build knowledge with communities. Yet we are teaching students to go and help communities solve their own problems. So there's a dichotomy in that in terms of education. But I'm appreciative of the contributions this evening, but also I think for me, nkuthazo to say my frustrations are valid. And I'm happy to learn that I'm not the only one who's frustrated and who's wanting to effect the change that is needed. And I'm particularly happy, I think, with your readings, Prof. Magoqwana. By the way, we once met at Mandela. In my master's, I was doing student hunger research under Mansfield. We briefly spoke then. But I'm happy and I'm looking forward to engaging with your material that you have written, because social work, as it is, we like boxing knowledge that we teach and prescribe only people who are social workers to the students. And I find it problematic. For example, we can learn from how you have theorized the role Kamakulu, the role Katadubao, because social work with us African people, it's not about the qualification, but being able to care for each other. But, the understanding and the teaching of it at the moment, we teach it from the point of view Kafervoet, because he's the founding figure of social work, and is a founding figure of apartheid, by the way, as well in South Africa. So thank you very much, colleagues. I hope we can, continue engaging in such conversation, but in the future also go to the communities, because I so wish that communities can join the conversations we have, so that the conversation do not only stay in what we call the ivory towers. We need to be practical about the community being the center, and also university existing in the community, and not continue with the rhetoric that decolonization up there, but do the people on the ground really understand it's just nice because apparently we are learned people. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Apia. Jasmine, sorry, I missed your hand
Hi.
earlier. Thanks.
Yes, hi. Thank you. Thank you for this beautiful session. Actually, this is like priceless, this conversation that's going on. And I appreciate Mr. Madlingozi. Yeah, what he said, that the decolonization should start from the within, like from the individual level. And I know, like I'm studying at WITS at the moment, but I'm basically originally from Bangladesh, and we were colonized by British Emperor for 200 years. So we can see its effect in like it can cause identity crisis and lots of, I think, the immigration surge that we see from those countries. Like, I think it also is an effect of that colonialism. So, and if we, like, it's my comment actually, like if we don't start decolonization from the within, then the society can't progress very far. And it might be the institutions' responsibility. I don't know, like they can, like by building knowledge, how to start this individual the decolonization in the individual level, and like it could be a social movement, because like if we grow up with this colonial mentality, and then when we are adult, it's not easy to decolonialize suddenly, so it should start from the root level, from like, so that the children, like they can be in the process and grow up as a decolonialized person. And there should be some programs also. I don't know what that is. That could be that how we can, like, bit by bit get out of it from the individual level. So it's not a one-day movement, like it's a movement, like since we have been decolonialized for hundreds of years. So to decolonize should be thousands of years, maybe, I don't know, but we should start the process. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And then Apiwe is the final, and then we invite sort of concluding responses. Apiwe. You can unmute, Apiwe. How do I help? Unmute. Apiwe, can you maybe put on your video? Okay. Well, maybe Apiwe, when you've sorted yourself out, you can let us know. I think what I'll ask is, oh, I can't seem to unmute. Why is that? Try again. Do you want me to read? I think you did put a question on or a comment. Let me see what you had said. I can't seem to unmute. If I can find, you had said, what policy reforms are needed to advance decolonization projects in South Africa? How can government institutions support initiatives aimed at decolonizing and promoting indigenous knowledge? We don't hear from the government when it comes to decolonizing. Okay, so what I'm going to do then is just request, let's maybe go, let's go in the original order, it's fine. And just Farouk, maybe you can make your concluding remarks just as part of the responses to the, I can't see Farouk. Farouk, are you still around? Yeah, you are. Oh, there you go. Let me pin you guys again. How do I do it? The spotlight. Is that how we do it? Yeah, okay, then I'll try and, okay, then just start responding. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nomalanga. I just want to respond to the lady that was speaking about the arts and the difficulties she has in lecturing the students and things like that. And she was asking a question: do the lecturers only have to do research and stuff from books and not from the oral histories of our people? So the university really needs to find the sweet spot when it comes to Western-centric and non-Western-centric knowledge, and then build from there. What was the question that you were just addressing now, Nomalanga, from the lady Apiwe? About the government, yeah.
About government,
okay.
or maybe government is
a process
building houses.
No,
I don't know.
No, there is a process from the Department of Science and Innovation in conjunction with Northwest University, where they are busy with the Ottokwa people in the Karoo, and they're busy compiling the BCPs. So what is the BCPs are is the biocultural diversity protocols on how certain tribes, if you can call it that, or certain people want to be governed, and the indigenous knowledge that goes with it. And I know for a fact here in Port Elizabeth, I attended some workshops for the House of Klaas and David Stierman, and they just concluded their BCPs, which is the Biocultural Diversity Protocols. It's a thick booklet on how the Gamtower Nation, historically the people that was living in Port Elizabeth up to the Gamtoes River, up to Storms River, Storms River in English, those people, that region was called Gamtoes, which is a Khoi word. So they call themselves now the Gamtower Nation. So that's the people in Hankie, Patensie, and the whole of the Gamtoes region. So the Department of Arts and the Department of Science and Innovation, governmental department, they are already embarking on that journey where they go to different communities and look for which historically Nomalanga, they check the maps, they cross-reference things. They can't just go to me and say, oh, Farouk, you look like this person, so now I'm going to do a BCP for you. No, they obviously do their homework, and they contact family members that used to live there. They look at old maps of farms and kraals, which kraal was where, and then they obviously come with that research before they approach the community. So I know the House of Klaas and David Stierman currently concluded their BCPs, and in that BCPs I've read through it is governance, how they want to be governed, how they want to be seen by government, how they govern themselves, indigenous knowledge when it comes to medicinal plants, so I know Dr. Fraser is Dr. Denver Fraser. David. They were working on a project where they were David, yeah. Sorry, Denver David. Yeah. They were working on a project where they were taking pictures of all the plants, all the fauna, and the flora. All the flora, yeah, and then putting it in the database. So that's exactly what the governmental department is doing at the moment, where they capture all these different indigenous plants. So when your big pharma companies comes to these areas, I'm talking areas specific to these regions, whether it is in KZN, whether it's in the Eastern Cape, if that plant is growing in the Eastern Cape and those people historically has been using this plant for stomach or your headache or whatever, then there's a process that the big pharma needs to ask permission from the leaders of that community to cultivate or to farm or to do whatever with this plant, and then the communities must benefit from that. You understand? So government is making a concerted effort in that regard. I know they already helped 2 communities, which is the Ottokwa in the Karoo, and they just concluded about a month ago with the House of Klaas and David Stierman, where they compiled this booklet called the Biodiversity Cultural Protocols. That is to answer a previous question.
Okay, thanks. Can I just move to, just looking at the time, move to Tshepo for your responses?
Yeah, no, thank you. Just to say that I agree that we need the state to come to this question very, very clear. I must say that, part of my work at the Human Rights Commission as a commissioner in charge of anti-racism and justice and education, these are some of the policy questions that we will be dealing with. Babalwa, made this point that we are dealing with a crisis of governance in South Africa. We are dealing with a crisis of state capture. State capture not in the form of material corruption, but state capture also in the form of spiritual, epistemological, political, capture by, the Washington consensus, the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, and so forth. So we really need to help our state that as they do this work, they really embed themselves in the real struggles and the real understanding of what people are talking about. There's a danger that as the state is claiming to do decolonization, they commit two mistakes. The first mistake is a mistake of re-nativism, what I call re-nativism or re-tribalization, because it was an apartheid project, to tribalize us, some of us, including, Professor Mkhize, we've got different names and different surnames, it's mixed masala, and that is South Africa. That we know, no one can claim to be 100% Zulu, 100% Sotho, whatever that means. And really, as we do this work of valorizing our life words, valorizing our cultures, let's be careful of not re-tribalizing ourselves. The second mistake is a mistake of assimilation, going to so-called indigenous traditional communities, taking their knowledges in order to reinvigorate Eurocentrism or to spice up capitalism and Eurocentrism. So the problem of retribalization, the problem of assimilation, let's be careful of that. But really, we can't just do this as universities. We need the state to really understand, this question, and really the question about from Manisha and from Jessica about the limitation with how we approach knowledge. There's a story that someone told me. I think it's apocryphal. I think it's not a true story. But that there was a student in UNISA, did a PhD, and had one footnote of one reference for the whole PhD. And they said, no, you cannot pass. And the reference was that I got this for my grandmother. Every time I sleep, she will come and give me this knowledge. And she was failed, because it was not based on the library and so forth. But if a Western scholar came and interviewed the mother when the mother was still alive, it would be considered anthropology, and then valid. But if somebody comes, my mother has passed, but my mother is with me now, So how do we understand? How do we incorporate that? Of course, it must be able to be tested, whatever valid, within our, so the problem of the written form, it's really a problem. How do we incorporate music in legal studies? One of the things that I did before I left academia was to do a first-year textbook, which was really my dream, to do a first-year textbook. And our first-year textbook, which is in law, incorporates poetry, incorporates newspapers, incorporates, video links, to say that the law can be found in all of these spaces. A book like, The Wealth of the Ancestors, that we all know, a very good book, is a book about law ultimately, So how do we incorporate different knowledges within our subdisciplines, even beyond the written word? The last thing is to say, universities cannot be decolonized. They can only be transformed, but they cannot be decolonized. Thank you.
Thank you. Then Babalwa, your final responses. Just unmute.
Thank you so much, colleagues, and thank you for the conversations and the comments. But one of the things that I forgot to mention, it would be very unfeministy of me not to mention the fact that decolonization was captured by the masculine tendencies, even in the visuals of decolonization. That is the conversation for another day, where the native is a man and the woman has been pushed to the corner. But that's a conversation for another day. We'll have another conversation. And how we are trying to reimagine the future, I think it is a collective project. The government has put the legislations in place. Sometimes institutions seek to manipulate the legislations to suit their own interpretations of what needs to be done. And the corporate sector has been completely mum, with 10% of diversity in this country. So 90% being, white males. And this is the thing that when we are talking decolonization, we should not think about government only. Let's think about the corporate sector, the NGO sector, the institutions, different institutions, and the communities themselves who refuse diversity at times. So what I'm saying is, it is a collective project, but it is a project that is worth every time that we dedicate to it. But it cannot happen outside building communities that can take the project further in our absence, because ultimately we are going to leave, someone else must come and continue. But it must be grounded in the terms of the African people. Without that, we'll be reproducing what we think we're trying to correct. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Jenny.
Thanks. I don't think I really have anything to say at this point. I also know we're running out of time. I've just been thinking the whole time since Audre Lorde has come up twice. I wanted to. There's a poem, I think it's called "I Was Never Meant to Survive," and when Babalwa spoke about, this need to survive within this inherited colonial system, essentially, and in South Africa, I mean, and many other parts of the world where those material realities are so harsh. Like, I was never meant to survive, I think survival becomes to some degree a radical act, or an act of resistance. So I felt I had to add to the Lord references because she's amazing also. I love her work.
Thank
so
you,
anyway,
colleagues. Let me decolonize the screen by removing the spotlight, and then ask everyone to maybe put their videos on, and we can thank you so much to the colleagues, everybody. This was quite very interesting, as usual, the kind of critical debate that is being had, at least at Nelson Mandela, and would just conclude by saying thank you. And what was a beautiful thing that was said today? We are there. This is a sisterhood. It's a sisterhood, all of it. All of it is a sisterhood and a community. So thank you, colleagues. I don't know if there's an announcement or something that must be made about next. Thank you.
Yes, I'm going to do that, Nomalanga, but I want to join in your thanks to everybody and you as well. It was a fantastic workshop, raising so many different issues in such an amazing and timely way. Thank you so much, colleagues, for doing that. Just so you know, you had 330 people register for this workshop, which is the most we've had so far, and over 100 people attended. So there's been a fantastic response, I would say. So the next two events we have in May. In May, we have our Brazilian colleagues doing their workshop, Decolonization in Context, and that will be on the 8th of May. And on the 22nd of May, we also have Dr. Tamari Katosa giving a talk on Black masculinities. As usual, Mansa will send out all the information that you need so you can register and attend. Thank you so much once again, everyone. Thank you, colleagues. Bye-bye.